Welcome to our video covering one of the unique methods of trading with trend lines. This is a first part of the three-part video series. This method is known as TD line method and it is developed by Mr. Thomas DeMark. In this part, we will see how to identify the basic TD points and how to plot TD lines. Entry points, stops, and targets and modifications or adjustments to TD points will be covered in subsequent parts. Now, before we start with this method, let us see how a normal trend line looks like on chart. We can see that all the lines drawn on the chart are valid trend lines. We all draw the trend lines connecting swing highs or swing lows. However, at times it can be confusing as to which trend line is to be used for making a trading decision. This depends on an individual comfort and judgment. You can observe that two different individuals will base their trading decisions on two different lines. Considering that the normal trend line method is subjective, Mr. DeMark developed a mechanical approach for drawing trend lines. You will be surprised to see the results when you start using Mr. DeMark's trend line method. Now, I don't want to mock the normal trend line method. If used properly, the same can be very beneficial. Coming back to our TD line method, what Mr. DeMark did is he started with identifying pivot points which he called TD points and classified them into TD demand and TD supply points. So the first step for drawing TD lines starts with identifying valid TD points. Let us see how the same looks. Now you can see I have marked this couple of points like TD demand and TD supply point. So for a valid TD point, demand point, at least 3 candles or bars are required. In this, the low of bar 2 is lower than the low of bar 1. Further, the low of bar 2 is also lower than the low of bar 3. In this case, bar 2 becomes the TD demand point. In the same manner, for a TD supply point, at least 3 candles or bars are required. In this, the high of bar 2 is higher than the high of bar 1 and the high of bar 2 is higher than the high of bar 3. In this case, bar 2 becomes the TD supply point. I hope these points are clear. What we have seen now is a level 1 TD point. However, there can be level 2, level 3, level 4, etc. TD points too. We will look at how to identify level 2 and level 3 TD points. Look at level 2 TD demand point. At least 5 bars are required to identify a level 2 TD demand point. In this, the low of bar 3 is lower than the low of bar 2 and the low of bar 2 is lower than the low of bar 1. In addition to this, the low of bar 3 is lower than the low of bar 4 and the low of bar 4 is lower than the low of bar 5. Now let's take a look at level 3 TD demand point. For this, at least 7 bars are required for identifying a level 3 TD point. In this, the low of bar 4 is lower than the low of bar 3 and the low of bar 3 is lower than the low of bar 2. In addition to same, the low of bar 2 is lower than the low of bar 1. Further, the low of bar 4 is lower than the low of bar 5. The low of bar 5 is lower than the low of bar 6 and the low of bar 6 is lower than the low of bar 7. The same logic is applied for a level 2 or level 3 TD supply point. The only difference is we look at the high of pivot bar and the high of its adjacent bars. Let's look at the diagram for level 2 and level 3 TD supply points. I hope this concept is clear. This process can be continued and there can be any level of TD demand or TD supply point. Now let's view TD points on the chart. We can identify TD demand points on the chart. We can see that the low of the marked bar is lower than the low of the previous bar and the low of the next bar. Here is one more TD demand point. The condition mentioned earlier is satisfied here too. This way, we can identify various TD demand points on the chart. In the same manner, we can identify the TD supply points as well. we can see that the high of the marked bar is higher than the high of the previous bar and the high of the next bar. Here is one more TD supply point. This way, we can identify various TD supply points on the chart. Once TD demand points or TD supply points are identified, the next step is to draw TD lines. For drawing TD lines, only two valid TD points are to be connected. So unlike a normal trend line which can be connected by joining many swing high or swing low points, a TD line can be drawn by connecting only two TD points. Further, TD lines are dynamic and are adjusted in time as the market develops and new data is printed on the chart. This statement will be clear when we look at the chart. The last and the most important point, TD lines are drawn from right to left. Now this may seem unconventional, but the logic behind this is to identify the latest TD point and draw a line towards left to the most recent TD point in the past. Mr. DeMark highlighted that weightage should be given to the most recent price action, and therefore the starting point of a TD line is always from right hand side. Let's view the same on the chart. This is a daily chart of Axis Bank. I have marked couple of TD supply points, namely point B dated 30th April 2020 and point A dated 17th April 2020. Once TD supply point B is identified, we start looking for the most recent TD supply point in the past. The same is identified at point A. Then we start drawing a trend line from point B and extend the same till point A, and we have a TD supply line. Remember, a TD line or that is a TD demand line or a TD supply line can be connected with 2 points only. Now let's see what happens when new data is printed on the chart. The dynamic nature of TD lines will now be clear from the following chart. This is daily chart of Axis Bank itself with additional data printed till 14th May 2020. I have now marked three TD supply points, namely point C dated 13th May 2020, point B dated 30th April 2020, and point A dated 17th April 2020. As a new TD supply point C is identified, we start looking for the most recent TD supply point. The same is identified at point B. We repeat the same procedure and start drawing a trend line from point C and extend the same till point B. And we now have a new TD supply line from point C to point B. TD line drawn earlier from point B to point A will now have to be ignored. For easy identification, I have marked the previous TD line, that is from point B to point A, in red. This process is to be continued every time a new TD point is identified. I hope this part is clear. The same procedure is to be followed for drawing a TD demand line. Now we shall look into one of the most crucial aspects of TD line. Before we start with the same, note that generally level 1 TD line is formed when level 1 TD points are connected. Level 2 TD line is formed when level 2 TD points are connected. Level 3 TD line is formed when level 3 TD points are connected, and so on. Kindly pay attention to this chart. I suggest to watch this part 3 to 4 times in case the same is unclear. I have selected this chart on purpose, the reason for which will be clear in a moment. We can see that we have identified a level 3 TD point, but we cannot find any other level 3 TD point on the chart. But we do have a level 2 TD point. Now the question arises as to whether level 3 TD point and level 2 TD point can be connected. Here, there is a difference of opinion in various authors who have researched on the DeMark's method of TD line. According to me, these points can be connected. However, the trend line drawn by connecting these TD points will be level 2 TD point. This is done under the premise that level 3 TD point will always be inclusive of level 2 TD point. Further, look at the circled bar. You will see that it is a level 1 TD point. Again, the question arises whether a level 3 TD point can be connected to level 1 TD point. According to me, these points can be connected. However, the trend line drawn by connecting these TD points will be a level 1 TD line, with the premise being the same that level 3 TD point will always be inclusive of level 1 TD point. According to few people, these points cannot be connected due to difference in levels of TD points. That is to say that a level 3 TD point can only be connected with a level 3 TD point. Level 2 TD point can only be connected with level 2 TD point and so on. This is a more conservative approach, and even though the number of potential trades may reduce, there is merit in this opinion too. Considering this, I suggest that you do your own research on the same and implement any of the above mentioned approach in your trading according to your comfort level. The key here is consistency with the approach selected. I hope this part is clear. The benefits of trading with TD line method are: this method is totally mechanical and objective. It has well-defined set of rules. The entries, targets, and stops are clearly defined. Now this can be modified or adjusted. We will see how to modify or adjust the excess in subsequent parts. Finally, I would like to conclude that even though it may seem little unconventional to draw TD lines from right to left, let me assure you that eventually it will come with ease. I hope you have understood the concept we shared here.